Explained by the Billy Meier contacts, mysteries, myths, legends, conspiracy theories, historical inaccuracies, and more, compiled by David Chance, revised July 2, 2025.
Future Earth Humans Part 7. See also Gilgamesh. See also Hyperborea, Hyperboreans. See also Ica Stones. See also Longskulls. See also Men in Black. See also Nazca Lines. See also Nokodemion. See also Ptah. See also Quetzalcoatl. See also Rods. See also Starchild Skull. See also Teos Caves Metal Library. See also Tunguska Event 1908. See also UFOs Flying Saucers.
Contact Report 70. A note. The following excerpts explain how some ancient Plejaren ancestors found their way to Earth. See also Contact Report 5, S67 to 193, Contact Report 9, S120 to 170, and Contact Report 121, B79 to 90.
But now the other thing, where we are also interested in the history of the Aryans, if you know anything about it. Start where the earliest ancestors were still in their original home.
At the beginning of our contacts, I have already mentioned in detail the history of the destruction and reconstruction of the original homeworlds.
Excuse me, you mean the destruction of worlds, etc. by the Destroyer? Where was that actually?
Sure, that is what I am talking about. The later original homeworlds were planets in the constellation known to you as Lyra and near Vega, in a different space-time structure, which is shifted from yours by a fraction of a second. Few of the worlds there are still inhabited today by different races, all belonging to our wide alliance. Our early ancestors had mastered space travel for more than 22 million years, carried out expeditions and exploratory flights reaching far into space, and came to Earth for the first time. However, the Earth, was still deep in the late primordial development, and was therefore left to time for the further development. Nonetheless, Earth was often revisited to release criminal elements, humans, that were detrimental on the homeworlds. Only a few millennia, however, did this last, and then, for reasons unknown to us, they relinquished the Earth and left this world alone for many millions of years, during which life of all kinds, already developed on Earth, could continue to develop in a natural sense. Except that at later times, the abandoned life forms mixed with human-like life forms already on Earth, which happened for the first time a few million years ago. Millions of years went by as the primeval races spread far into space, also developed themselves in a consciousness-based manner, and acquired great powers. But not yet mastering control of these, they were used to doing evil things and became evil for many worlds. During the primeval catastrophes caused by the Destroyer, 2/3 of humankind were destroyed on the very early original homeworlds in another level of the universe. Through hardship and privation, however, they soon found a new beginning, so they were able to build a new civilization and culture in less than 9 centuries. By working and researching together, they created a very great technology which reached further than anything they had ever seen before. At the same time, they also developed their consciousness, the powers of which they were not yet able to control. So the time came when they built themselves flying ships, with which they could also leave their space-time structure and could rush through the free and wide space of the levels of the universe. These were flying apparatuses of disc-like form and with beam drives. With these devices, they flew out into the vastness of the universe, to other solar systems and planets, which they had expeditions to and colonized, either peacefully or through murderous wars. Often with evil violence, they created new life possibilities and new living space for themselves because they needed it due to the proliferation of the human beings of their peoples. It was especially the scientists who searched space for ever new worlds and solar systems, and it was no problem for them because their ships were equipped with all technological possibilities, which made them absolute rulers. Their weapons were of immense power and prowess, so battles with whole peoples of foreign worlds were only very short and one-sided, in favor of the conquerors. In particular, the scientists recognized, in the course of time, the unlimited possibilities of their consciousness-based powers, so they pushed and expanded them by immense accumulations of knowledge until they became a matter of course for them, and they swung themselves even higher up, whereby they soon became absolutely dominant over their peoples. According to their great knowledge, they were called Jishwish Ish Wish, which is synonymous with the name God, which is familiar to you and which means King of Wisdom. The Jeshwish, far superior to all people in terms of knowledge and ability, subjugated all life forms, cast a spell over them, and ruled them in a dictatorial form. For several centuries, exactly after 864 years of today's terrestrial era, the people rose up in a revolution that at first smoldered underground, but this led to the Jeshwish taking violent measures and trying to nip everything in the bud, which did not succeed completely. The domineers killed innumerable human beings, or simply eliminated them completely with their terrible weapons, so that not a single speck of dust remained. This, however, increased the anger of the people, and underground they were secretly preparing for battle. Preparations took 4 long centuries in secret form to break out in one sudden blow into a far-reaching and open war of liberation, which spread and dragged on over many other dimension worlds of the Lyra and Vega systems. More than 60% of all things of cultural value were destroyed and completely demolished. Some races were completely wiped out, while others were only able to survive with extreme hardship. 3 worlds of the Lyra systems were simply completely eliminated and dissolved into energy by a novel process that is now also under development on the Earth in its very beginnings. Earth humans already call this insane weapon according to its deadly value, namely overkill. Still, as a fantasy product of a perfect technology, this weapon of total elimination, which is in research and construction by scientists, has already found entrance into various books and films describing this cruelest of all weapons in futuristic novels to save Earth humans from the last madness. According to the terrestrial calendar, the event of the outbreak of the War of Liberation in the Lyra and Vega systems dates back some 230,000 years. The commander-in-chief of the terrorizing forces was an Jeshwish called Asael, who, after realizing the hopelessness of the struggle, escaped the vengeful and victorious peoples by a quick escape into the space-time structure of this level of the universe. Secretly, he managed to seize a powerful fleet of 183 large ships and 250 space reconnaissance ships, with a total crew of 360,000 human beings, and to escape under the most severe combat actions. They quickly left the home systems, only to wander through the again-shifted space-time structures for many restless years, before one day they found a large star system, which offered them the necessary possibilities for life, far away from their original home systems. The new star system encompassed 3,000 light-years and 254 partly still young, and therefore blue-shining suns, which partly, however, already had their own planetary systems with only a few habitable planets. The whole star system was named after the leader of the escape fleet, namely according to your word value Asael's system. After taking possession of this young star system, where various planets had been made habitable by the titanic fugitives over the course of 300 years, and a new humanity had been created. They set out again in larger groups to explore space and develop new habitats. Of the 3 worlds made habitable, various expedition ships were equipped, after which the Titan fugitives flew out into the vastness of space to reach and take possession of their predetermined destination after 17 years. These were stars and planets in their dimension beyond those stars known to you as Hesperides, which have their own worlds circling around them and were only weakly inhabited by human life forms, which were subjugated by the conquerors. During 2 centuries, a new culture was created on these differently dimensioned Hesperide worlds and inhabited by emigrants from the Assal system. Another 70 years later, Assal walked the path of all transients. He died. He was succeeded by his daughter Plejaren and Jishrish, female queen of knowledge, goddess, and consequently the home system. The Assal system was also renamed the Plejaren system because for the human beings of that time, who were Titans, symbolization was still very much in force, as it still is today with the human beings of the earth, which corresponds to a perverse illegicity. Under the supreme command of the new leader, Plejaren, further expeditions were prepared to expedite a very distant and lonely solar system, located in this, your space-time plane, which according to all calculations must have come into possession of a section of a planet from the original earliest home systems, after the destroyer had destroyed the earliest original homeworlds many millions of years ago. According to the calculations, however, the destroyer itself must also have taken the same orbit, thus it had been changed in its orbit by the sun of the distant system and had been introduced into the system in a recurring orbit. These calculations were like a hint for the Titans, which is why they set off for the distant system, not knowing that their ancestors had already flown to this system and abandoned undesirable elements on a world millions of years before, namely on the Earth, your homeworld. So the expedition ships set off again, and after many years reached the SOL system, where they forced 3 different planets under their rule and began to build a new culture. However, these planets, Earth, Melona, and Mars, were still extremely inhospitable and hostile to life, so the majority of the expedition fleet left the worlds again after a few years, leaving only a few behind, who slowly faded away and joined the animal-looking feral descendants of those earlier abandoned ones millions of years ago, as well as the pure Earth-born ones. The scientists of the Plejaren system, like their earliest ancestors, left the Earth to its natural development, making expeditions and monitoring visits only here and there, and then leaving the human beings who had become completely wild and were now left there to their hard fate. This lasted many thousands of years. Then, when the idolism had been abolished in the Plejaren systems and the leader Plejaren had died, a new intelligence developed on the Earth through the descendants of the feral abandoned ones, which led to the fact that the Plejaren system inhabitants, who were constantly observing the Earth, came forward with new expeditions to Earth and once again built up a culture in the same manner as they built up a culture on the 4th planet, namely on the world of Melona. Still very barbarically inclined. However, power struggles broke out again among the new settlers after less than 300 years, which led to the fact that the Earth had to be vacated by an order under force from the home systems. Melona, on the other hand, remained inhabited because the population there remained peaceful. But this only lasted for barely 40 years, and then the greed for power among the 2 different peoples also took hold there. And before any orders could be made from the home systems, the Melonians destroyed each other and destroyed the whole planet. Since then, the debris of the once beautiful planet between Mars and Jupiter has been orbiting the SOL, the system's sun, as a long-lasting memorial to human madness. 78. From the homeworlds, the development of the Earth has been constantly monitored, and expeditions have been sent to it year after year. From the homeworlds, the development of the Earth has been constantly monitored, and expeditions have been sent to it year after year. Again and again, attempts were also made to repopulate this very beautiful world, but these failed miserably time and again over the course of more than 800 years. All kinds of life forms were deported to Earth, also those you would call prisoners, to simply abandon them there and leave them to their fate. Robbed of all technology, it was inevitable that they would wither and become overgrown, mixed again with the overgrown descendants of earlier elements and with Earth humans, and became bestial. But then the time finally came when the great enterprise was finally taken up. With several hundred large and small spaceships, the Earth was once again approached and seized. A great culture was built up, which lasted for 600 years before the greed for power among the highly ambitious scientists increased again, and led to new terrible acts of war, whereby once again everything was destroyed to the last. The Earth reverted to its old existence, where life forms continued to exist, but quickly became wild. For 400 years, the Earth was completely unnoticed and left to its own devices before it was approached again. This time, however, it was no longer an attempt at an expedition, but once again an escape. On the homeworlds in the Plejaren star systems, power struggles broke out once again between the ascending scientists and the peoples, who were enslaved by their terrible weapons and other means. Note: sentences 89 to 138 have additional explanations given in Contact 703 by Ptah. But, while on all three homeworlds the vicious battles of annihilation raged, a large group of dissident scientists came together under the leadership of a certain Pelagon, who already had the status of an Ishwish. This was the Titan Pelagon the Imperious, who was a power leader of the Hammud dynasty, which ruled over all the Plejaren peoples of all the Plejaren planets until before the creation of peace some 52,000 years ago. Under his leadership, 70,000 human beings were gathered, including many scientists who seized various spaceships and fled the Plejaren planets. According to the coordinates of old records, the refugees entered this space-time structure and the SOL system, and thus once again arrived on Earth, where the Titans once again settled. According to earthly time calculation, this was about 190,000 years ago, about 194,770 years. The unpeaceful warlike times triggered by Pelagon the Commanding, and continued by all his successors for some 39,000 years, meant that peace and tranquility did not arrive until some 150,000 years ago. But they did not last long. Millennia later, some 6,000 years after the establishment of peace, tranquility and freedom, however, a scientist and distant descendant of Pelagon the Commanding, named Pelagon the Militant, again set out, in imitation, to likewise rise in rebellious fashion as the leader of a 70,000-strong fighting force in thrall to him. These fighting units were a 70,000-strong fighting force out of 7 since time immemorial, permanently mobile for security operations and combat actions, each under the command of a Hammud dynasty leader appointed for the purpose. Pelagon the Commanding was a great-great-great-great ancestor of Pelagon the Militant, who some 40,000 years later, that is to say, some 150,000 years ago, equally brought a 70,000-strong fighting unit under his command and fled to the Dern universe. This occurred while his son, Pelagon the Marshal, was seizing power on the home planets at the same time. Pelagon the Marshal was a scientist and surrounded by many followers, and also leader of another 70,000-strong Hammud dynasty fighting force with which he plunged worlds into warfare again. as was then continued by all his numerous successors. These periods of strife then continued for more than 100,000 years. When Pelagon the Militant, the father of Pelagon the Martial, seized several capital ships with the help of his combat unit and fled, the dimensional gate had already existed at that time for about 30 million years, which he used and transported with his combat unit to various inhabited solar, that is to say, planetary systems in the Dern universe, and finally also reached Earth. Here, however, in the course of time, feuds and campaigns of conquest broke out among a part of the fighters, as well as acts of war were carried out, after which it was finally decided by a part of the prudent ones that no longer a longer stay on the planet should be allowed for the fighters. So, following the death of Pelagon the Martial, who was killed in hostilities, a general forced departure from Earth of the unruly and quarrelsome outcasts took place, with the destruction of everything that indicated their former existence. But the outcasts fled to distant systems where they resettled, while those who remained on Earth fell under the command and Hammud leadership of Pelagon the Patriarchal. On the home planets, the vicious war was fought to the bitter end, and the scientists were put in their place. The form of government was abolished and placed in the hands of spiritual leaders who proclaimed anew the long-forgotten spiritual teaching and taught the peoples. These recognized the value of the teaching, took it to their own hands, and henceforth lived according to it, after which they found final peace some 50,000 years ago, and henceforth lived according to the law and recommendation of absolute creational determination, which has been preserved until today and will never change again. The times of strife and war ended only about 52,000 years ago, when the unrest and battles were finally fought out for the last time, ended, and all the troublemakers and warmongers were finally put in their place, and then final peace, freedom, and tranquility were created. So the unrest and warfare which, after the short period of peace lasting only about 6,000 years, 150,000 years ago, lasted again for more than 100,000 years, after which, about 52,000 years ago, the peace, freedom, and tranquility, which has lasted until today, and will certainly last in the future, was actually created. However, during the 100,000 years of unrest and warfare, many events also followed, which were triggered by the refugees under Pelagon the Militant on Earth, where they had found their way. After the death of Pelagon the Militant, other Hammud leaders took over his legacy, after which the early refugees and their successors went in and out of Earth from 150,000 years ago until 52,000 years ago, and were also temporarily resident on Earth. In the course of the next 8,000 years, the Plejaren peoples, as they were referred to from then on, developed to a very high spiritual and consciousness-based level. Consequently, they allied themselves with all kinds of foreign and their own peoples in near and far systems, and lived now only in the harmonious evolution. Thus they developed together into a great alliance, in the course of which they carried out new expeditions and, 51,951 years ago, found in the galaxy of Andromeda a half-spirit world inhabited by half-spirit beings, an already extremely highly developed life form, which existed and exists only half materially, but therefore already half spiritually. In best agreement with these life forms, everything was resolved that they should in future guide the destinies of their peoples and their great covenant with their gigantic knowledge and wisdom, which was joyfully welcomed by all peoples. Consequently, in agreement with the spiritual leaders, who were human life forms and spiritual teachers, it was decided that all destinies of the future should be guided by these half-spiritual forms which had become best friends. The form of guidance should be that of a counsel from a higher spiritual level, which is why this guidance and advice was referred to as the High Council, which has survived to this day and will never change again. Since then, all folks of all races connected to us have been under the guidance of the High Council, which never gives any orders, but only a High Council, which is optional for each individual form of life to follow, and which, as a rule, is also followed without exception. Those who fled to the earth knew nothing of the end of the wars for the time being. These refugees were Titans and the most distant descendants of the 70,000 refugees of Pelagon the Imperious, who brought them from the Plejaren planets to the Dern universe and the Sol system to Earth more than 190,000 years ago. In the joy of their newly won freedom, they gladly submitted to the tight regime of Pelagon, who had chosen 200 scientists as sub-leaders and deployed them according to their fields of knowledge. Pelagon the Patriarchal was the first successor leader to carry on the legacy of Pelagon the Commanding, who was then followed by various other Hammud leaders. Under their leadership emerged large cities with other inhabited areas, and a very high culture developed on all the continents of the earth, which had resulted from continental shifts over about 300 million years. For about 10,000 years, harmony and peace reigned. But then again, an Jeshuish called Jesus came out, who murdered Pelagon's successor and seized power over all the, by then, united different folks and races. 20 years later, however, the folk rose up against Jesus, and a terrible and worldwide war broke out again over the earth by those who had traveled farther. Many hundreds of thousands fled with large and small ships into free space, set down and settled in another space-time structure in Beta Centaurus, which you know in your space-time structure as the Barnard Star. This was not in the Dern universe space-time structure, but in the one where the Plejaren planets also exist. A few million humans remained on the Earth, where everything that had been built by the extraterrestrial humans had been completely destroyed and totally eliminated. Those left behind, deprived of all technical and other cultural possibilities by the complete total destruction, gradually fell into a wicked lethargy, atrophied, and became wild beings in a nasty barbarism. All knowledge of their original origins and highly developed technology was lost, and their former high development of consciousness atrophied almost completely, with the result that in the course of time, the 2.5 million feral titans largely exterminated themselves and became cannibals. For 700 years, the Earth was simply avoided, before the descendants of the fugitives set out again to populate the beautiful blue world again. These new arrivals, or the distant descendants of those who had left the Earth earlier, were on the one hand not titans, but human beings of smaller dimensions. But they too were not exactly of a peaceful nature, but nevertheless no longer as warlike as their ancestors. This was 133,000 Earth years ago, according to your current chronology. The returnees were led by an Jeshuish with the name Atlant, married to an Jishrish named Caryatide. In the latest episode, under the leadership of Atlanti, the continent of Atlantis, which had been headed for again and again, and used for millennia, was expanded and made habitable, while under the command of his wife Caryatide. Lesser Atlantis came into existence, as at the same time her cousin Muras built the gigantic city of Mu, which, like Atlantis, also found its origin in very early times. The reason for the construction of these cities so far apart was that the humans had become cleverer through all the wars and hoped for peace as a result of the great distance between the cities, if everyone stayed in their domains. So it went well for many long years, a whole 1,800 years to be precise. Then, however, again some scientists exalted themselves, whipped up by lust for might, and tried to snatch up control for themselves. After the death of Atlant his wife Caryatid, and Maras, various other leaders took over. This time, however, they had not reckoned on the people's memory of war, which had been passed down over the ages. The lore was only maintained by those who returned, but not by those who remained on Earth, who were deprived of all achievements and values by a complete destruction of all technical, cultural, and other things, whereby they finally gradually withered away and became savage beings who fell into barbarism and eventually died out. So before the scientists could strike, the folk rose up against them. Through an accomplice, the scientists obtained possession of spaceships and fled into the space-time shifted regions of Beta Centauri. This was 115,000 Earth years ago. After 2,000 years, during which the malicious refugees again created a high technological standard and produced many descendants, they returned filled with hate to the Earth. After they had increased their hate immeasurably against the extraterrestrial inhabitants of the Earth, and were only able to preserve order within their own ranks with terrible punishments. Spurred on through their inhuman hate, they, through research and the knowledge obtained from it, drove up their life expectancy to more than 1,000 years. Their single wish was, however, to gain control over the Earth, for which reason every individual was taught wicked intrigues and was instructed in the craft of war. After 2,000 years, this hate-drenched people was so far along that it could venture an attack on the Earth. Therefore, it manned its ships and came newly to the Earth, and indeed under the leadership of the Swish Arus, the barbarian. This happened 113,000 years ago. Arus was extremely bestial and barbarous in his disposition, and his power was feared. Like Pelagon, already thousands of years before, Arus also had 200 high-level scientists with him, who he made sub-leaders. In a lightning action, they fell upon the Earth, robbing, murdering, and taking possession of the land. Primarily, they conquered the distant land in the northern regions, where the climate was moderate and very good. These were those regions, which are traditionally known to you as Hyperborea, and which were far in the north, before an upset of the Earth shifted its axis, so that the then regions exist today where you name Florida. Coming from the north, Eris's son, Eris II, set out and fell upon those lands which today you call India, Pakistan and Persia, and so forth, whereby they struck the earliest forefathers of the Sumerians, who, peace-loving, fled and set down far in the south, folk of dark-colored skin, but by your terms. Not Negroid, but like Europeans, and of tall growth, risen from a race of former Syrian refugees, who had likewise settled on the earth 133,000 years ago, as did the refugees from the Plejaren system. Named after Eris II, the India of today was at that time called Aryan, which, however, split off from Hyperborea after a few centuries, after 210 years. To be exact, and joined with the inhabitants of Mu and Agharta, while from Hyperborea, Eris I constantly troubled Mu and Greater Atlantis by wicked war activities in order to become their ruler. During around half a millennium, or said very precisely, during 502 years, those war machinations continued until Eris I, who in the meanwhile had become old and weak, succeeded in infiltrating wicked elements of his hater humans into the leading controlling ranks of Atlantis and Mu, who secretly stirred up violence and hate for so long, as also did their descendants over several centuries. Until, through boundless intrigues, Mu and Atlantis were able to be completely destroyed some centuries later, while the only few survivors were beaten into servitude. However, great scientists, in knowledge of the coming things and conscious of their powerlessness, set off in spaceships and fled towards the early homeworlds in the Plejaren systems, where they were affably received. Only small peoples remained on Earth, whose ancestors had long since mixed with early Earth humans who had emerged from Earth's development and created their own cultures. I indeed do not need to speak yet again about the destruction of Atlantis and Mu, because you will find that as a separate chronicle in the explanations given to you. So it only remains for me to report that Ares XI, as a very distant descendant of Ares I, was murdered in his old age many thousands of years later, and around 100,000 years after the destruction of Mu and Atlantis, by his third-born son Jehavon, after which this one took over command of the Hater people in order to rule these and 3 earthly peoples and the Hyperboreans himself. The one Earth folk consisted of the very distant descendants of the Armus folks who had lived where the region of Armenia is today. These were descendants of the Chwish Armus, who settled there with his race 133,000 years ago, after he had emigrated from the Plejaren systems. These descendants were already genetically aligned with Earth humans in such a way that their primordial origin was no longer ascertainable. Consequently, their original origin from the Plejaren planets 133,000 years ago, and their development in terms of hereditary traits and characteristics, as well as dependent elements, could no longer be proven. The second Earth folk, which fell under Jehavon's control, were the descendants of the Aryans, who meanwhile had mingled themselves with the still very underdeveloped, pure earthly and lethargic native population after the Sumerians were expelled. The third Earth humans were not really such a people in themselves, because they were a very widely disseminated alliance of gypsies, which was interspersed with Jehavon's spies and saboteurs, who, in unity with the gypsies, brought about dissension everywhere, greedily drawing everything to themselves, and were always constantly eager to murder, burn, and rob, for which reason one named them the Hebraons, by the original language of our forefathers, therefore Hebraon, and later then Hebrons. These names correspond to gypsy, scum, and outcast in the sense of the original language, which therefore has not been transferred to your present languages, because the sense of your present term for gypsy still only means the wanderers, the itinerant, and the unsettled ones. Thereby, it should be clarified that the present gypsy people have not the least in common with the Hebraon of that time, who proclaim themselves the firstborn and the chosen ones, just as much as do their distant descendants, who today still dare to assert this. In truth, the Hebraons were the real scum and outcasts of Earth humanity, because through them fights and quarrels within the whole world were constantly stirred up and yet further spread, which has been maintained until the present day. Earth will only finally be at peace. Then, when this power-hungry and bloodthirsty Hebraon alliance, which has declared themselves as a people, and which has split into various sects addicted to world control, and so forth, has been fully dissolved. Jehavon ruled until about 3,660 Earth years ago, until he was likewise treacherously murdered by his only son Jehav, who then snatched up rule for himself, after 340 years of his father's reign. Jehav ruled wickedly, and always screamed for blood and revenge, until 3,320 years ago in your chronology, during which time he sired 3 sons, who were named Arisem, Ptah, and Salam. Megalomaniacal like his father Jehavon, he let himself be proclaimed as creator, and celebrated as such, and like his father, he caused terrible devastation among the 3 human races, and he demanded blood and death. As addicted to power as his father Jehav, was also his firstborn son Arusem, who constantly wanted to take over his father's power. Thus, he also finally murdered his father Jehav and wanted to snatch up the power for himself. But he failed profoundly, because his younger brother Ptah and his youngest brother Salam positioned themselves against him in order to expel and ban him into exile. because, having become disgusted by the constant wars, power struggles, and bloodshed, Ptah and Salam already made an effort themselves for many decades to lead humane forms of life. Therefore, already for a long time, they assembled around themselves many like-minded ones, with whose help they gained control of Arusam and his 72,000 followers, and expelled them. But Arusam secretly returned to the earth and settled down with his army in the land of Egypt, in the old cubicle constructions which had existed there unused for more than 70,000 years. Deep in the interior of the earth, and deep below the pyramids, they established themselves securely, whereby they converted the rooms and buildings deep below the present pyramids of Giza as a center for their wicked purposes, from where they and their descendants since then tried to realize their tyrannical plans, but as of now without noteworthy success, although their way of obtaining the goal of deceit, lying, and intrigues was through false teachings and the leading astray of the uncorrupted earth humans through religious teachings of madness and cults, and many kinds of other evil machinations. Due to their expulsion, they, however, forfeited very much, because all possibilities for technological and otherwise scientific further development was prevented for them, as also, however, was all their research, and so forth, which thereby led to the quite rapid reduction in their life expectancy, and today still only amounts to an average of 94 years, which in relation to today's people converts to practically only about 20 years higher than the average in European regions. This means for the renegades, called the Giza intelligences by us, that they are slowly dying out, and today are still only fewer than 2,100 in number. Due to complete isolation from outer space, these remaining ones will also be no more in fewer than 3 decades, because they are all already old and no longer capable of procreation. But in spite of that, they still maliciously hold firm to their tyrannical plans, and they do not see themselves as beaten. Arusam ruled until about 3010 years before your time reckoning began, 3010 BCE, until a powerful forced departure was secured for him by a mutineer by the name of Hen, who was called Jehovah in the tongue of the Hebraons, and likewise also gradually within his own ranks, whereas the appellation the Cruel One was added. In the year 2080 BCE, already old and weak, he was displaced, and his nephew Kamagal I took over the evil command of the Giza intelligences. In order to expand the headquarters below the surface of the Pyramid of Giza to a murderous center of power, which allowed no possibility at all of being destroyed anymore. Like no ruler before, Kamagal I forced all earthly religions under his control and created terrible cults which demanded human blood, which were able to be partially maintained until the present. All efforts from outside were in vain, as his position of power could not be broken. But also Kamagal I was only a human, so one day he met his own fate from out of his own ranks, in the form of his own son, Kamagal II, who overthrew him and deprived him of power, and let him die miserably in a deep dungeon. Kamagal II was in many things even more malicious than his father, which he soon revealed. After taking over power, through the introduction of monstrous mass murdering of earth-born terrestrial human beings, who he slapped under his religious power through many kinds of means. As one of the last really extremely long-lived, Kamagal II attained a great age and died a natural death just a few days ago, which we were able to ascertain just 2 days ago. He departed this world on the 27th of December, 1976, therefore around 10 days ago. The still remaining Giza intelligences, already old and weak in many cases, but still filled with hate and tyrannical plans, do not give up. But indeed their days are numbered, so in 3 decades at the latest, they will be no more. With the heaven suns, the Hyperboreans and the emigrants from the Plejaren system, Ptah and Salam, the sons of the murdered Jehavon, led the further rule by common agreement. They governed well and created peace, and only occasionally mixed in the affairs of the earth-born earth humans. After his 93rd year of government, Ptah was stricken by a malicious and unknown disease, from which he succumbed a few days later. Consequently, his brother Salam continued to lead the government alone, until, weak from his great age, he handed over command to his son Pleios, 2040 Earth years ago, after he had taken up connections to the homeworlds already centuries before, and had placed himself and his people under the home form of government, namely that of the spiritual teachers. His son Pleios was, like his father, a very wise and a kind governor, and as of 1,999 years ago of earthly chronology, the homeworlds, after an interruption of around 240 years, newly positioned themselves under the guidance of the High Council. He too arranged himself and his people therein. Respecting and following the advice of the High Council, he prepared for the long-yearned-for return to the homeworlds, which took place 1,994 years ago, by your chronology, after Emmanuel, at Pleios' direction, begat by the spiritual leader Gabriel, was educated as a prophet and had become right for his mission. Still to mention is that among the very distant descendants of Eris, who had subjugated the lands in the north, there existed elements in great number, who, until in the time of Jehavon, preserved themselves as the Erisists. These, a group of 160,000 humans, were named the Great Aryans, because they still advocated the ideas of Eris I. They even released themselves from the powerful control of Jehavon and wandered, plundering, through the land, from northwest to the east, where they penetrated into that land, where in earlier times Eris II had settled with his people and expelled the Sumerians, where, in the meantime, however, the then Aryans mixed themselves with the low native population and forgot their actual origin. Also, in the meantime, the descendants of the Sumerians returned to their old homeland, so also they settled there again. But then came the Great Aryans, who moved between the Caspian Sea and Ararat, and took possession of the clay brick towns of the mixed folks, which had reached a good level of prosperity as a result of the earlier invading Aryans and the returning descendants of the Sumerians. Their work consisted mainly of trade and agriculture, which was well mastered by the Sumerian descendants. So, the appearance of the human beings and all their buildings was very orderly, and a strict discipline ruled. Indeed, even a certain submissiveness towards the highly developed Sumerian descendants, who were superior to the native people in consciousness-based development and worldliness. And exactly this world was attacked and forced into bondage, and transformed and pressed into a new state structure by the Aryans, who, deprived of all technology, had been wandering for long years, coming from the far north. Deprived of all technology by Jehavon's Myrmidons, the Aryans settled down in the distant lands, but in time became stunted and mixed with the natives. So soon all knowledge and ability of a higher level and of their origin disappeared into the darkness of forgetfulness.
Ha, good. But now two more questions, or three, regarding our and your Pleiades. So this name comes from en-GB-LibbyNeural. Was it simply retained later on Earth? Or was this group of stars referred to differently here?
The name was retained, but lost itself in the confusion of languages that appeared on Earth, and then, over time, returned to its original value, mainly due to mythologies.
These are probably the ancient Greek as well, right?
Sure, but there are also others, as you mentioned through the main one.
Well, then I would like to know what form of time calculation you use, at least on era. Do you also calculate in years like we do?
Of course, because they are originally from our ancestors, so they are also given on the Earth.
Aha. And since when do you calculate? I mean, since when or when did your time calculation begin?
Since the beginning of peace on our home systems, so about 50,000 years ago.
Aha. Can you give me the exact date?
Sure, today we count the year 51,711 because there was once a break, but it was not due to war, but of reconstructive importance.
Good. And now the question of how Era got its name and when.
This is very simple. The Pleiades stars of your space-time plane are much younger than the Earth, but not so with our stars and planets, which were named only by numerical values until the time when the High Council took control. Since then, however, at the request of the High Council, our homeworlds have been called by melodious names, for example also Era, while the celestial systems are called Pleiadian, or, in our case, Plejaren.
If I think correctly, this should have happened 51,951 years ago, right?
Sure, you think correctly. But I would also like to explain to you that at this point in time, the new era was also introduced. So we have two of them. The year 51,711, which reminds us of the final peacetime, and the year 51,951, which reveals the spiritual alignment with the High Council.
Contact Report 74.
It is damn easy for you to talk, girl, because you do not have these idiotic worries about money, because you do not know such material means anymore.
Contact Report 75.
Over there in the area where I usually go is unfortunately not possible today because some of our friends are exploring everything over there. We do not want to disturb them in the process. However, they have been quite careless in the last few days because they have already been observed twice in their spacesuits, which they have to wear because they are not oxygen breathers in our sense. But your carnival costume-wearing customs have protected them from the attention of the observers, because they were probably of the opinion that they were carnival connoisseurs.
That is interesting. What exactly do they do there, and where do they come from?
They belong to the other groups working with us here on the Earth. They are also connected to our Federation and investigate radiation phenomena and underground Earth shifts that have come about as a result of various interterrestrial factors, and that will influence the future of that region.
Do they belong to you, and how big are they?
Their size is 115 centimeters, and of course they belong to us, but they live on a smaller neighboring planet of Era.
Ah, look, Bernadette sleeps in Jacobus's car.
She does not sleep, she just doses.
How do you know that?
Look here, this device, these symbols say that.
One noticed that Engelbert's cat went crazy.
But because of the cat, animals are very sensitive and feel us also when in invisible state. In order to help you, I analyzed Martin Johannes Sorge a little more closely with the technological aids provided by Quetzal.
Contact Report 77.
In certain respects, we are bound by limitations that do not allow us to penetrate deeper into the thought spheres of a life form. Especially in these matters, we ourselves do not have the necessary knowledge, because many forms of human life on Earth are still foreign or incomprehensible to us, primarily the mental forms.